Hey Unwrappers, Ollie here. Before we get going, I'm here to let you know that this week's show is brought to you in part by IG. IG offers a range of investment products, whether you're an active share trader or prefer to have your portfolio managed on your behalf. They want you to be the most informed you can be when investing, so they offer educational resources and tools available 24/7. And with access to over 70 key US stocks outside of normal trading hours and zero commission on US stocks if you trade 3 or more times in the previous month, you're primed to make the best of any opportunity. Note, market liquidity can be lower and spreads wider compared to main session trading. If you want to find out more, search IG Investments. The value of shares, ETFs and ETCs can fall as well as rise, which could mean getting back less than you originally put in. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 26th of November, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Supreme Court ruling that the Scottish Government cannot hold another independence referendum without UK government consent, China recording its highest number of daily COVID cases ever, and comedian Joe Lycett protesting David Beckham's involvement in Qatar's World Cup by pretending to shred £10,000. You can read more about all of that in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is the boss man, Holden Frith from BBC Sport, its journalist Emma Smith, and from the One Decision podcast, broadcaster Julia Macfarlane. And Emma, thank you for taking time out from what must be a rather busy period for you.
Yes, I mean, if we could keep the friendly banter to a minimum, Uruguay South Korea's at 1 o'clock and I don't want to miss it.
Does working at BBC Sport mean that you're allowed to have the World Cup on during the day, or do you sometimes have to pretend you're writing something?
Oh, no, like for the England-Iran game earlier on this week, like I was working on something else, but you could just have it on the TV. The perk of the job that you don't have to have it like on a secret sort of screen and like listen to it on your headphones. It can just be there out in the open.
I was in a meeting during the England game earlier in the week, and there was a surprising amount of cheering coming from the meeting room next door. So I think either someone was making a very, very good presentation, or there was a bit of sneaky watching.
I'd walked through a political news office yesterday, and I saw someone actually flick the channel as I walked through with the important boss person. Anyway, well done for getting a job where you're allowed to watch it, Emma.
Thank you.
Holden, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Have you heard of a man called Donald Trump?
Did you use that $916 million loss to avoid paying personal federal income taxes?
Of course I do. Of course I do. And so do all of her donors, or most of her donors. I know many of her donors. Her donors took massive tax write-offs.
So have you not paid personal federal income tax?
A lot of my write-off was depreciation and other things that Hillary, as a senator, allowed. And she'll always allow it because the people that give her all this money, they want it. That's why. See, I understand the tax code better than anybody that's ever run for president. Hillary Clinton, and it's extremely complex, Hillary Clinton has friends that want all of these provisions, including they want the carried interest provision, which is very important to Wall Street people, but they really want the carried interest provision, which I believe Hillary's leaving.
Donald Trump, during the second presidential debate back in 2016, bit of a classic moment, that one, Holden. Quite a lot has happened since then, but what's happened this week?
Yes, apologies to all those whose PTSD I've triggered. But yeah, that was Trump claiming he knew the tax code better than anyone who's ever run for president, which is probably one of the truer things he said during that campaign. What's happened this week is that the prosecution has rested its case in the trial of his company on charges of corporate tax evasion and grand larceny. This is one of a large and growing number of legal headaches facing Trump, his family, and his company. And though he's not personally among the defendants in this trial, it is the only one that's actually gone to trial so far. And I think what's notable about it is that for something in Trump's world, it's actually got surprisingly little attention given the amount of analysis and commentary that's sort of generally outpoured upon any pronouncement or development in any of his cases.
I suppose in a pre-President Trump world, Julia, it actually wouldn't get much attention because, it's just another American corporation defending itself against accusations that, it's avoiding taxes. That's pretty common, isn't it? I suppose it's the fact that he has been president and wants to be president again, which might make this more worthy of our attention.
Yeah, I mean, Trump himself, earlier when he was sort of under pressure from how he's handled his taxes and for not sharing his tax records, he said that it made him smart that he had managed to avoid paying tax before he was president. Do you remember he also stood up and said that he could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and his supporters would still vote for him? And so in the grand scheme of things, a little bit of tax evasion probably isn't getting the headlines at a time when he's also facing some trouble over there's a lawsuit on the efforts to overturn the 2020 election. There's a case in Georgia that's currently being heard. The January 6th committee is looking into the insurrection at the Capitol. Trump had all those years of allegations of whether he colluded with the Russians. I mean, he's sort of been through the ringer and he's Teflon Don. None of this has stuck so far, but the tax cases and some of his possible financial misdemeanors may be what gets him in the end, or at least perhaps his company. And also some of his family members are also in hot water as well. There's a case looking into Deutsche Bank and Jared Kushner and possible money laundering. But what is interesting, I mean, all of this is interesting, but what is also interesting is that he wants to run for president again. And even if he were to get a criminal conviction in some of the other cases that he's facing, it wouldn't stop him from running from president again.
And the problem with that, Emma, I mean, there's many problems with that, but the problem with that for Republicans is that clearly might split the Republican vote. You know, you've got people who are happy enough to turn a blind eye to Donald Trump being the leader if it meant the Republicans could win. But if he no longer looks like a winner, you've got half of them who would much rather rally behind, clearly, a candidate who's likely to win without all this stuff hanging over him.
Absolutely, and sort of saw that start to come to pass in the midterms where the Republicans' underperformance was quite widely blamed on sort of Trump's interventions shortly before voting day. And for all that, obviously, as Julia mentioned, there's been all this stuff around Trump and none of it seems to stick and none of it seems to stop either his company or his political career. There is the fact that if it's going to keep on carrying on up until 2024, and there is going to be this stuff in the background that is going to split the Republican Party, it's going to really sort of hamper their chances of re-election. I mean, there's been comments from journalists and Republican politicians that basically if anyone other than Trump runs in 2024, they have a really strong chance of winning. But as Trump remains still so popular with his dedicated fan base, there is still that chance that he will be hanging around when it comes to 2024, and that could impact the Republican Party very negatively.
And could members of the Trump family face incarceration, Holden, even if not Donald Trump?
So in this particular case, the one that's on trial now, no, this is a trial of the Trump organization and one of its subsidiaries as sort of corporate entities. Just to go into a little bit of the detail of what they're accused of. The charges are that the company was giving senior executives luxury cars and Manhattan apartments and then reducing their salaries by the value of those payments. So effectively, these were payments in kind. And it was then allegedly falsifying records to hide those transactions and not paying taxes on them. The Trump organization denies all of these charges, and the defense is still making its case. Parallel case being prosecuted by the New York Attorney General, which does personally affect Trump and his three eldest children. And in a separate legal development, which there were many, a judge ruled that trial can now go ahead, and it's been scheduled for October next year, which is particularly bad timing for Trump because that's when he will be gearing up for the presidential primary series, which begins in January the following year.
And something that's maybe more accessible to ordinary Americans because it's easier to digest into late night monologues, frankly, is this business of the House saying he does now have to disclose his tax returns, the ones that he was promising in that clip you played of him versus Clinton from 2016, to disclose all the way through his election campaign, and never has.
In fact, the Supreme Court backing the House's claim that he should, and that this is a Supreme Court that now contains many Trump appointees. There was a delightfully ironic tweet, not tweet because he's not quite back on Twitter yet, but a social post on his on his network where he accused the Supreme Court of being a political body that was pursuing only political ends. But no, I think it does feel that this week in particular, there has been these three big developments, all of which are going to make it much harder for him to escape that kind of general sense of, I don't know, fatigue that seems to surround him. Like you just saw that his announcement just didn't generate the excitement or attention that he clearly hoped it would. And I think there is just this kind of weariness with all things Trump in a lot of the electorate. Clearly, not all of it, but I think it will be harder for him to run this time around.
Yeah, I mean, talking of those late night monologues, Julia, here's Jimmy Kimmel from the other night. We already know he cheated on his wife. We know he cheated on his taxes. He cheated on business deals. He gives almost nothing to charity. And he tried to get an election overturned. Unless he's also secretly the chupacabra, what's left to hide? I mean, there's a feeling like it doesn't matter what the document says. People have made up their mind about Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Holden says about the fatigue is so right. And I think what has been absolutely fascinating to me is seeing how the Murdoch empire has finally dumped Trump. And there were all those really unsavory headlines about him. And the thing is, what a lot of people said about the midterms was that a lot of the people who were taking Trump's talking lines of going back to the 2020 election and going back on all these old issues and these old hangovers and all of these old things, that didn't resonate with the voters. And the real success story for the Republicans in the midterms was Ron DeSantis, who had a very positive campaign about the future and about the future of the Republican Party. And so he is obviously the biggest obstacle to Trump becoming the nominee again, and particularly since he's lost the support of much of the conservative media. I mean, I think he has an uphill battle to try and get to be the candidate for the next election. But I think, all of these cases, all of these things about Trump taxes and all this is stuff that has been circulating in the media for years, and they are old talking points. And it is a sort of a hangover from before that I think much of the American Republican electorate are increasingly sort of done with.
If we do end up with DeSantis, though, as the Republican candidate, Emma, that then has an implication on the current president as well, doesn't it? Because it's clear that Joe Biden would want to stand again, I think, if Trump was the opponent. If he wasn't, you do wonder whether even Biden's people might ask him to politely step aside for someone 50 years younger.
Yeah, quite possibly. And I mean, there's the age factor. If Biden was to run for re-election in 2024 and won, he would be by 2028 86 years old. So the numbers are pretty stark in that. And then there's also the stark numbers of the fact that he's polling particularly poorly. I don't actually have the exact numbers in front of me, but he's not polling well at the moment. Like I said before, the view is that basically the Republicans, it's their election to lose if they put up a candidate who isn't mired in as much controversy as Trump. I mean, DeSantis is mired in a certain amount of controversy. I mean, he's the Florida governor who's been behind a lot of the Don't Say Gay and the anti-trans bills in Florida. But he certainly has, as the midterms show, a huge amount of momentum from the conservative base. And so it does very much look like, and the case that the Republicans have options that aren't Donald Trump, which you would suspect that if things went according to logic, then it would be a non-Trump candidate who would be selected to run against Biden in 2024. But trying to apply logic to American politics at the moment is a fool's game, to say the very least.
Although it does seem, Holden, that maybe everyone in America, much like we've just had in this situation in Britain, where the vast majority of the population here were anti-chaos, let's put it that way, like, whether they supported Liz Truss or not to be Conservative leader, did not like what happened next. You just wonder if people have just had enough of the volatility of a candidate like Trump, who can just, with an utterance, with a tweet when he was on Twitter, just completely change the national conversation and disrupt things. That feels less appealing these days. People want stability.
Yeah, and I think, another parallel that was often drawn between the UK and the US was the sort of seeming scandal-proof nature of Boris Johnson. And With him, he was scandal-proof up until the point that he wasn't, and there was this sort of tipping point. And once the spell was broken, it broke quite quickly. And as we've seen, he wasn't able to then rekindle that. There was that sense that no, we don't want to roll the dice again. We want something a bit more predictable, a bit more solid. I do know, though, that from following US coverage, there's a lot of Democrats who are very wary of the idea that Trump is a spent force. They think he will come roaring back again if they let their guard down. And I think there's probably a bit of superstition there of not wanting to bank on an uncertain outcome. And possibly also it does serve Democrats' political interest to talk up Trump, talk up the threat that he poses. That clearly motivates their base. But I think the old line about all political lives ending in failure is a pretty reliable one. And for all of Trump's exceptionalism, he does look much nearer to failure than success at the moment.
We wouldn't like that, Holden. But I doubt he's a listener. Okay, Julia, I'm coming to you next after this. I'm here to let you know that this week's show is brought to you in part by IG. IG offers a range of investment products, whether you're an active share trader or prefer to have your portfolio managed on your behalf. They want you to be the most informed you can be when investing, so they offer educational resources and tools available 24/7. And with access to over 70 key US stocks outside of normal trading hours and zero commission on US stocks if you trade 3 or more times in the previous month, you're primed to make the best of any opportunity. Note, market liquidity can be lower and spreads wider compared to main session trading. If you want to find out more, search IG Investments. The value of shares, ETFs and ETCs can fall as well as rise, which could mean getting back less than you originally put in. And now, on with the show. Julia, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why Russia stole art, paintings, and Potemkin's bones.
Are you shocked?
Shocked. Shocked, it's not the word. I'm furious because this particularly show what does Russia mean when they're fighting against our identity. So if there are our heritage, there is our identity. If they stole heritage, they believe that we wouldn't continue to live and to create, but we will.
Alexander Tkachenko, the Ukrainian Minister of Culture, speaking to Channel 4 News on Monday. Julia, what was he talking about?
So Ukraine has accused Russia of looting nearly 15,000 artifacts from a Kherson art museum, which was probably around 80% of their collection. And what happened allegedly was on Halloween, dozens of soldiers and their collaborators, including some of the museum staff, they loaded thousands of paintings and objects from the museum onto trucks for several days, which were then carted off into Crimea, which is still held by Russian sympathizers and allies. And when Russia had controlled Kherson, they had actually tried to convert this particular museum into a Russian cultural center, but it didn't really go very well. And what happened this week was that Ukraine dispatched their culture minister, who we heard from, to speak to the gallery director. And this museum, it had a huge collection that covered the history of the region, but also collections that reflected Ukraine's ties to Europe. There were paintings and masterpieces from famous artists who we would know and recognize. Artwork from across Europe was represented. It took years for the director to curate that collection. And this is important because part of Russia's war in Ukraine has not just been a war of conquest of Ukrainian territory, but also a war upon the psyche and the identity of the Ukrainian people. And this has been part of that.
So this was an expression of that identity as being part European, part Soviet, I guess.
Yeah, and a lot of this, Putin has this imperial obsession, and something that was very intriguing that happened this week was that the Russian soldiers and their collaborators, they announced that they had stolen the remains of Prince Grigory Potemkin, who was the lover of the Tsarina Catherine the Great. And he was this 18th century Russian commander. And he helped Catherine the Great conquer parts of Ukraine back in the 1780s when she was at war with the Ottoman Empire. And Potemkin was said to have been the one to persuade her to annex Crimea, the first time that Crimea was annexed back in the day. And he's known as the founder of Kherson and Odessa, and he was really instrumental in this push to establish the new Russia, which is part of now southern Ukraine, where Kherson is. And so this is significant because it mirrors Putin's imperialistic ambitions when it comes to Ukraine. And, he's repeatedly said Ukraine isn't a real country. The Ukrainians are Russians and Ukraine is part of Russia, which is why, by the way, it's very important not to call it the Ukraine, because that basically sort of plays into that whole idea, cough, cough, Radio 4. But it was really interesting because the New York Times reported that Russia had actually ordered their puppet rulers in Kherson to send a specialist team to this 18th century cathedral in Kherson to specifically steal the bones of Potemkin. And so the idea is that now Potemkin's remains are going to be paraded in Moscow, and Putin's probably going to make a big deal of burying him somewhere in Moscow in a very lavish tomb somewhere for propaganda purposes.
Yeah, but he wants control of Ukraine. That's the strange thing, isn't it, Emma? There seems to be, as with much of the Russian military strategy, frankly, kind of two things going on at once, right? Like, on the one hand, we don't want European art in the gallery in Kherson because we're going to establish a Russian cultural center. I mean, that's depressing, but it makes sense. But on the other hand, we're going to take back Potemkin's bones because basically we don't trust this Russian figure to be buried in Ukraine anymore, but they want to make Ukraine Russian. Like, the two things don't seem to be motivated by the same desire.
Yeah, it sort of shows a lack of joined-up thinking, I think, which probably explains the Russian sort of military strategy in Ukraine. I mean, you can compare it to the Russian behaviour in Syria, where Putin portrayed himself as the saviour of culture, and there was very much an idea of the Russians attempting to rebuild their, the concert at Palmyra and things like that, restoration of sites such as that.
Yeah, so there was an attempt to say, well, we're supporting Assad, but we're doing it because we're anti-IS, and look, IS, they dismantled Palmyra, so we're going to restore it.
Exactly, and there doesn't seem to be sort of that thinking in Ukraine where they're both attempting to sort of show Russian values into Ukraine while simultaneously showing that they're part of Europe. It's all a very sort of mixed up sort of strategy, and basically, while in Syria there was very much a case of trying to build PR with the restoration of sites and things like that, and going on a cultural offensive, in Ukraine it's very much been a say a PR disaster is to use sort of like understatement, but that's very much the case, and that's certainly the case as far as the cultural aspect as well as the military aspect is concerned from a Russian perspective.
Yeah, and when people are dying, Holden, it's understandable why the theft of paintings and old bones is not the news's main agenda. But actually, it is worth, isn't it, watching that piece from Channel 4 News that we played the clip from, because Lindsay Hilsum there really explains why it's important, this stuff, and what it means. And she uses the phrase culture war, which struck me because, that's something we come across on a daily basis on social media to basically mean a division between the Karens and the TERFs. There's these sort of labels that people give each other, and they say, here's one basket of people, here's another, that's a culture war. This is an actual war about actual culture, and old paintings are part of it.
Yeah, I think that's why this story feels like it has more significance than the fairly frequent plunder that happens as a side effect of war. When armies are marching into new territory, there's often sort of disruption, looting. You saw it in a lot of the Arab Spring protests. You saw it after the invasion of Iraq. It's something that does sadly tend to happen a lot in conflict, but it feels like it's a sideshow, and as you say, less of a source of sorrow than the human lives lost. But in this particular war, it is a war about culture and history and identity and the ability of people to tell the story of their people through museums and exhibitions. And so, I think it does feel like it is an act of war. It's part of the not particularly successful operation Russia has had to try to claim that Ukraine isn't a country, and the artifacts that it's taking out of Ukraine and bringing back into Russian territory, it's clearly going to try and integrate them into its version of history and use that to kind of further its broader aims.
Yeah, and for people listening to this who work in the arts, it is a reminder of the symbolic importance of that work, isn't it? Which often gets undermined, I think, in this country, Julia.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the reason for this, it does sound like it's sort of a weird sort of logic what the Russians are doing, but you have to understand the way that they see Ukraine. I mean, the name Ukraine means borderland, and that's what Putin thinks Ukraine is. It is a borderland of Russia, and they have this ownership of Ukraine and everything Ukrainian as they see as Russian. And so what Ukrainians celebrate as part of Ukrainian culture, and that includes these paintings and these relics and everything, the reason why the Russians are taking this away is so that they are taking it out of the hands of the Ukrainians. It's a way of denying them parts of their own identity and parts of their history. And it's interesting because there are these obvious parallels that we have in history with the Nazis looting an astonishing amount of art throughout Europe. They looted all sorts of things, even a lot of silver ritual objects from Jewish homes and synagogues, and this was part of their genocidal campaign against the Jews and Jewish collectors and artists, and also because Hitler had this weird sort of view of what Aryan art should be and how art should conform to that. Everything should be traditional, and he was against a lot of the abstract impressionist art at the time. And it's just ironic because Russia originally tried to frame this war as a war against Nazis in Ukraine, where they're actually mirroring some of the practices that the Nazis were well known for.
Could you imagine a situation, Holden, where Ukraine might be able to get these paintings back?
It's a good question. There is clearly the precedent of the artworks and gold stolen by the Nazis from Jewish Germans and other European Jews. And
that required, the Nazis to fall.
To fall and then decades to pass as well. That was a long, difficult operation. There's an odd quote from the director of a museum in Crimea, which is also disputed territory, but now more firmly under Russian control. And it seems that some of the art has ended up there. And he said he has been instructed to take the exhibits of the Kherson Art Museum for temporary storage and ensure their safety until they are returned to their rightful owner. I suspect what that means is not the rightful owner, as in the Ukrainian museums they've been taken for, but whatever Russia deems to be the rightful owner. But I think some of the establishing ownership and the lineage of these artworks is going to be the subject of a lot of international court cases whenever whatever settlement that ends the conflict comes to pass. But I think, as you suggest, the ultimate destination of this is going to depend on the military outcome in Ukraine.
Okay. Emma, you're up next. After. Okay, Emma, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Not enough World Cup for you? Well, here's another half an hour.
Yes, I think so far we've had 5 halves of football that have gone beyond 10 minutes of added time. Now, as you say, there has been instances of injury which have forced that to go higher. But Pierluigi Collina was talking to ESPN last week, and he was explaining how FIFA really want to cut down on time wasting and get not just time wasting, but get the effective time for the ball being in play much higher. And he said that while people do focus on the general tactical time wasting of teams, it's not actually that which causes the vast majority of the ball not being in play. He says that on goal kicks, there's about 9 minutes lost in the game. The same for throw-ins when players don't really get the ball rolling straight away. And he says that while you can sort of hurry up players here and there, you can't really reduce the time lost there that much.
Dale Johnson, editor at ESPN FC, in a web stream on Monday. So, Emma, we've obviously heard a lot in the news about the World Cup kicking off. We've heard about the ethics. We've heard about the surprise winners. But this is about extra time.
Yes. So the first 5 World Cup games were notable because between them they had 85 minutes of added on time, which is almost the entire length of an entire football match. The England v Iran game on Monday lasted in total 117 minutes, rather than the usual 90 minutes, which even you, Ollie, knows is how long a football match should last. On Tuesday, the Argentina versus Saudi Arabia match, which was notable for being, as you say, Ollie, a huge upset, Saudi Arabia winning 2-1, but it had nearly 21 minutes total of added time. And the sheer amount of added time has caused quite a lot of interest, attention, and a bit of controversy.
Well, why is it happening? Because it happens in the Premier League, doesn't it? Because of, as Dale Johnson was saying there, sometimes tactical attempts to, prolong the game, change the situation on the pitch. Why is it particularly happening in the World Cup?
So there are some reasons which are down to situational events such as injuries, such as in the England-Iran game. But it's also down, as Dale Johnson said in that clip, to FIFA clamping down on time wasting. And this is an issue which football has had for quite some time. In the 2021-22 Premier League, it was a study across the board of all the games found that the ball was only in play for 55 minutes on average. And that for 25 minutes, it was down to time wasting, down to the ball being stoppages because of substitutions, injuries, ball being out of play. And it's now become an issue that obviously, if you're losing nearly an entire half of football because of these stoppages, something needs to be done about it.
Yeah, but so in answer to my question, why is it happening at the World Cup? Are you saying kind of isn't particularly happening at the World Cup? It's just the World Cup's thrown a spotlight on a problem that's just endemic in football now.
Well, the head of refereeing for FIFA, Pierluigi Collina, has said that FIFA have told referees to really clamp down on this. And so therefore, we are seeing a lot more taking notes of basically every single stoppage, and as a result, everything sort of being added on. And like I say, FIFA have basically really clamped down on this World Cup, and obviously with it being the World Cup, it puts it in the spotlight even more than it would do if it was in the Premier League or anything like that. And it is now resulting in these extremely long periods of added time, which are particularly notable because, you're not used to sort of seeing football matches which is supposed to be 90 minutes, going on for well over 100. And it kind of raises the question of, does football need to make a fundamental change then if 90 minutes, the traditional length of a match, is clearly not really very suitable?
But there is a solution, isn't there, Holden, being proposed to all of this?
Yeah, one of the ideas that's been proposed is, in fact, an idea borrowed from American football, where you stop and start the clock depending on whether the ball is actually in play or not. And so there's then no incentive for time wasting because there's nothing to be gained. In the words of a classroom teacher, it's your time you're wasting, not mine. But this, I spoke to a friend of the podcast, Mike Starling, who's running theweek.co.uk's World Cup coverage about this idea, and he's actually very much
eyes held open with matchsticks this week, I should imagine.
Yeah, he's in favour of this. He thinks it is an approach that makes sense, and it kind of cuts out a lot of the uncertainty. And the kind of incentive to mess around with faked injuries and deliberate delaying of corners, throws, etc., in order to kind of try and eke out a draw or hold on to a lead.
It's so interesting, though, isn't it, Julia? Because although football's always evolving, if you look at it historically, fans like to pretend that there is absolutely a cast iron version of the rules that can't be messed around with. See the fuss over VAR. You can imagine people saying, it's a 90-minute game. You can't mess around. Even though there is only 60 minutes play now, and this solution of a 60-minute game would keep it to 60 minutes play, they'd be outraged by this idea of changing the rules.
Yeah, I mean, I think, all sports have a natural evolution. And, like tennis has lots of rules that were not implemented when it began as a sport. And, I think it's part of the natural evolution of games. And I think, I can't keep track, frankly, on all the funny little rules that football has. I mean, so many boys over the years have tried to explain to me what on earth the offside rule is, and no one has yet managed to succeed in that. But I just, I think the stoppages and all this kind of stuff disrupting the play, why can't football just be more like rugby, which I think is so much more sensible, and the way they deal with extra time just makes a lot more sense. And we don't spend all this time arguing about it. You have 80 minutes and you pause play when there's any kind of stoppage, and if there is a draw, you have some overtime, and then the game ends when there is a natural stoppage in the game. And the result is you have really few draws at Rugby World Cups. I think there have only been 3 times that the World Cup tournament that teams have not managed to score a goal in either half. But I mean, frankly, I just think, FIFA have far more pressing things I think they should be dealing with than clamping down on extra time. I mean...
Well, I have an answer as to why, gained from my research experience for this episode, Emma, which is an unusual place for me to be, which is the comments section of thesun.co.uk. When this was raised there, their venerable readers said, we can't stop the clock because then it will become like American football and it will be exploited for advertising. That's why. It will become, this is something that corporate sponsors want because they can put an ad in it on telly, and that's why we have to resist it. I'm saying that more eloquently than they did, but that was the gist.
I'm sure. It's an interesting comment, that. It's actually not one that I'd considered, and actually there was at one point a couple of years ago a push to increase the halftime break in football from 15 to 20 minutes from FIFA, which was supposedly to give players an extra break and get them more fresh for the second half, but basically it was an excuse to try and get more advertising in, and it didn't go anywhere. I think that one reason why there's less of a push for a stop clock and 60-minute games in football is because there's less sort of chance for like sort of natural stoppages in football. Like in rugby, you'll have sort of much more sort of phased matches, and sort of like you'll have, and in American football certainly you'll have the attack, and then you'll have the four downs, and then it'll switch over. Whereas in football, it's a much more sort of fluid game with less sort of phases in that regard.
Well, would it be a worse watch then? Like, so if you kept, because stopping the clock doesn't mean stopping the action. Stopping the clock is reflecting the action having stopped, is the idea, right? So it shouldn't interrupt the fluidity. But do people worry it would change the way the beautiful game works? So you'd lose some of those spontaneous moments somehow?
Possibly. I think that there is also the aspects that if you try and change anything about football, or like sort of something slightly unusual in football, people get a little bit precious about it.
I think stopping the clock would change the way at least some parts of the game are played, because if you at the moment, if you're trailing towards the end of the match, it's really in your interest to just crack on as quickly as you possibly can. So if you get a free quick kick, you'll just try and take it really quickly, even if you don't have everyone in a perfect position, but you just need to use that time as best you can.
And the spectators understand that. That's part of the fun of it, isn't it? You're shouting, saying, go for it. Yeah.
Whereas if you stop the clock, it would then be in your interest to try and regroup, try and get everyone in a perfect position. As happens in American football, there would be that big pause where everyone regrouped. You kind of went to your starting positions. And I think, as a casual fan, I'm not that keen on the interruptions, the VAR, those sorts of appeals, because I think, as Em was saying, football isn't like cricket or tennis, where you have a kind of, in cricket you have sort of appeals built into the game, and it's a slow paced game. It takes 5 days. There's no real clock pressure against it. And tennis has the idea of faults and lets, and replaying ambiguous points built into it too. Whereas football does feel as if it, to me at least, again as a relatively casual observer, I kind of like it when it has the flow and the excitement, and the more precise and predictable you make it, the less charm it can sometimes have.
Julia, as someone who's not particularly a football fan, have you noticed the relative lack of interest in this World Cup?
No, quite the opposite. I find that the first 10, 15 minutes of every news program, every radio show, every TV news bulletin is taken up with World Cup stuff, and I find it incredibly...
You think it's not news, basically?
Well...
Because I think like that about sport news generally, but even I, during the World Cup, are like...
Thanks, Olly.
Wow, sorry. Even I, during the World Cup, think, well, Saudi Arabia won a match, Japan won a match. That is, it is news because it's unexpected, yeah. Yeah,
I find those upsets really, I find those upsets interesting, and I do generally, I love the World Cup more for the excitement, the international solidarity. It is something that everyone from so many nations are tuning into and watching. But I I really, really, really struggle to engage with something that is run by what I feel is, a borderline criminal cartel. I mean, we've known since 2015 that FIFA is steeped in corruption and money laundering and racketeering, and the Qatar World Cup. I mean, look, this is not the topic we were supposed to talk about, but I find it difficult to get excited about football given it's the current management, and I find it very difficult to engage with and promote it currently.
Yes. Well, I'm going to steer you away from that, not because it isn't an interesting topic that doesn't deserve our attention, but because it is actually, thankfully, the thing that is being discussed in the mainstream media rather than the football, which isn't our brief. I mean, Emma, have you noticed a difference with this World Cup finally compared to others? I mean, it does seem to me I'm seeing cars go past with England flags 1 in 10 rather than 1 in 3.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to sort of pull back the curtain too much on this show, but we were initially debating whether to discuss things like the One Love armband being forbidden by FIFA and things like rainbow symbolism and clothing being confiscated in Qatar. But in the end, it was decided that really didn't count as being under the radar because it's being what people are sort of like, I think the phrase you used, Ollie, is that it's over the radar. It's been so much discussed. Whereas the actual stuff that's happening on the pitch, like the huge amounts of extra time, is what's gone under discussed because the football has almost played second fiddle to everything else going on. And it has meant, I mean, I'm a football, as well as being a football journalist, I'm a football fan and I'm also in the LGBT community. So sort of having all this stuff going on has sort of tainted it. I mean, on Monday should have been a really sort of joyous day. England scored 6 goals, played some brilliant football, but the entire conversation was about how a very sort of lukewarm gesture by the FA, which was that armband, they weren't even going to do that. So I think that there certainly has been a sort of a very different feeling about this World Cup. But the fact is, when the football itself is on and you're watching England put 6 past Iran, or you're watching Saudi Arabia pull off arguably the greatest upset of all time, you still can't help getting drawn into it, and at least the football's good, and at least I've been able to sort of take solace in that, and for 90 minutes be able to shut out everything else going on, or not 90 minutes, nearly 2 hours in the case of England v Iran.
On which our clock has run out. I can't help feeling you were tactically playing for time there, Emma, and trying to steer things back into a football discussion, but I will not allow it. My thanks to Emma and Holden and Julia. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. We're always a punchy length. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.